This is a really fun interview to discuss with scientists and science communicators. It's kind of a worst case scenario for a scientist, and it's a scientist who goes into an interview with his eyes very open and very prepared for difficult questions and even a trap question that he's going to encounter. It's Dr. Gavin Schmidt. He's a climate researcher with NASA, and he's going on Fox Business News to talk with John Stossel. Stossel is absolutely opposed to climate policy. He's deeply skeptical about climate science. He originally wanted to do a debate, and Schmidt said, I'm not going to go on there and do a debate. That's misleading. Scientific opinion is not 50-50 on this. I'm not going to do that. If you insist, you could interview somebody who disagrees with me and then interview me sequentially. So that's the reference that you'll see at the beginning of this interview. And the thing to pay attention to here is that Dr. Schmidt sort of knows where the interview is going in some cases. He senses the trap questions coming, and it's because he's very, very familiar with misinformation in the public sphere about his field. He also understands that the real disputes in society are about climate policy. So he's prepared to talk about climate policy in a responsible way and to essentially point the interviewer to where their thinking might be challenged by other people in society when it comes to climate policy.
All right, so why is Roy Spencer wrong in saying we're not sure about man causing it?
So you made a good point earlier on. You said that climate changes all the time. It has, and it has done for many, many different reasons. It's changed because we've had big volcanoes. It's changed because the sun has changed. It's changed because there have been orbital wobbles in the Earth's path around the sun that has caused like ice ages to come and go. All of those things are totally true. So we've looked at the sun. It's not the sun. We've looked at volcanoes. It's not volcanoes. We've looked at the orbit. It's not the orbit.
This time, it's not those things.
But what we've been doing the last 150 years is we've been increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over 40% in terms of carbon dioxide. We've more than doubled the amount of methane, which is another greenhouse gas. And the signatures of those changes are very, very clear all the way through the system.
So this is kind of a detective story way of talking about what's causing climate change. And it can be effective with a lot of different audiences. I think it's effective in this particular instance because it essentially tell Stossel, go challenge something else, right? I'm talking about natural climate variation, which you're going to focus on to the exclusion of human influence on the climate. I'm putting it in context. It's a really solid answer and a good way of approaching this. And you'll see in his other answers, Dr. Schmidt always wants to take a step back and talk about a broader context and not fall down a rabbit hole with some specific point or some small framing choice that Stossel is making that he wants to push Schmidt onto.
This is true. Why is it necessarily a problem? Warmer might be better. More people die from cold than warmth.
We have built a society and an agricultural system and cities and everything that we do based on assumptions that basically the climate is not going to change. The fact that we have so much infrastructure right near the shore is because we didn't expect the sea level to rise. The damage that we had from Hurricane Sandy was increased because sea level has increased by 10 to 12 inches in this area.
President Obama says wildfires.
All right, so they're going to get into extreme weather, but just on that answer real quick, Schmidt is trying to broaden it out. He doesn't want to get trapped in a conversation about one single effect of climate change. He wants to put it in broader context, right? It's changing the baseline on which we've built our civilization. And now Schmidt's going to have to respond to some stuff about extreme weather, but also an attempt by Stossel to set him up on a specific point about hurricanes.
Increasing hurricanes are increasing drought. Is this true? I thought these things have always happened, and this is alarmism. You agree with that?
So there are some things that we can look at and we can say, okay, they're changing. Heat waves. We're having more extreme heat waves over a wider area.
Hurricanes, you mentioned Sandy.
Okay, hurricanes, there's more uncertainty in the science of hurricanes.
Are they increasing?
It's a tricky thing, hurricanes.
I mean, they have this graph of hurricanes by decade, and they don't show an increase.
Right. So I didn't say they did.
Right. So there's the trap, and it just completely fails, right? They were really hoping that they could embarrass Schmidt by bringing up this graphic, getting him to say that hurricanes have increased, but he's there to talk about sea level rise. He's going to talk about precipitation. I don't think he's actually able to get into frequency and intensity on hurricanes. It's a little more complex. He's not able to squeeze it into this interview, but he's always trying to broaden it out and not get hung up on these specific points because he's very familiar with how these specific points are used. and how Stossel is attempting to use them in this interview to cast doubt on the entire field of science that Schmidt works in.
Seeing more intense rainfall, that's very clear over the whole of the US, over Europe, and in other places as well. And now what's going on in the future, that's where we're concerned about. Because
what can we do? What we're
doing right now is not nothing. What we're doing right now is we're increasing the amount of carbon dioxide every year, year on year.
What can we do about it? We like burning fossil fuels.
No, you know what? You like the product of burning fossil fuels. Like you mentioned before, earlier on, about how dirty the air was when there was unrestricted burning of coal. Right? We don't like actually burning coal. What we like is the energy that comes from coal. Right? What we like is energy.
Yeah, and we like energy, and even if we cut our emissions in half, it wouldn't affect the world.
Oh, it would. If we cut our emissions by half,
it would be a tenth of the world's CO2. And we're not going to cut it in half.
Well, eventually we will, because eventually this is going to be a problem that is so large that we will transition to a more renewable.
But China isn't cutting, India isn't cutting.
That's a big problem, and they're not going to take a lead on this because we haven't taken a lead.
But why should we make poor people suffer?
I don't say you shouldn't make poor people suffer.
If you make fuel cost more, that hurts poor people.
Then you give it back as a rebate, and you make people understand that what we need to do is move off carbon sources of fuel.
So that last exchange was really interesting because what Schmidt's able to do is pick up on something deeper that Stossel is invoking, right? Stossel wants to talk about fossil fuels. Schmidt is taking a step back and saying this is actually about where our energy comes from, right? It's not that we intrinsically like fossil fuels or love fossil fuels. It's that we want the energy that we derive from them, right? And this is about the future of our energy system. So he does a really good job with that. They talk about U.S. emissions, they talk about China and India, right? And they talk about this quote, making poor people suffer. And Schmidt gets right to this idea, well, there are policy prescriptions for that, and to account for the fact that increasing the price of carbon would be regressive, right? There's ways to deal with that in the policy system by cutting people rebates. That's not something every scientist is going to be comfortable even talking about, but I think if you work on a topic that is perceived as controversial, where there are big policy disputes, one of the favors you can do for your audience, any audience as a scientist, is to be able to point them to the policy prescriptions that are out there so those audiences can be more conversant in them. And frankly, for an audience like this, John Stossel's not having people on talking about cap and rebate or other policies like that. So Schmidt has an opportunity to inject that policy idea into a show that is normally not highlighting it. And I think it's a really good way to address it, because a lot of scientists in a situation like this would say, well, I'm just going to exclusively stick to the science. And I think that that is often ineffective because the controversies are there on the public policy front. So you might as well address them, and you might as well just get into it. And even if you disagree with that or you feel differently about it, know that if you're invited onto a show like this, that you need to approach it with your eyes open. And you need to know that that stuff is going to come up. So I think Dr. Schmidt just does a great job here. It's hard to imagine a more difficult interview situation for a scientist. The only thing I think you face that might be more difficult in a scientific career is testifying before a legislative committee, particularly in the U.S. Congress, if they really want to go after you and go after your field of science and beat you up and ask you a bunch of tough lawyer questions. And that might be a topic for another day. But for now, way to go, Dr. Schmidt. That was super hard, and you did incredibly well. It's a wonderful object lesson in how to deal with very aggressive questions.